Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cannabis Basics, a discussion about a taboo therapy. My name is Jesse Christensen, and I am in my final semester at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Doctorate of Nursing Practice graduate program. In our final year, we are tasked to perform a year-long project, hopefully something that we have an interest in. Mine just so happens to be cannabis therapeutics. Welcome to my project. At this point in time, I have no conflicts to disclose. In April of this year, I will be presenting at the Wisconsin Nurses Association at the Monona Terrace on cannabis therapeutics. But other than that, I have no other disclosures. Some of the goals for the day, we will discuss the longstanding dysfunctional relationship in the life of cannabis. It's just going to be a brief history. I would like to update some terminology. I would also like to discuss some pharmacotherapeutics, physiology, and metabolism of the cannabis product. We will also discuss recreational versus medicinal use, intoxication versus medication, top 5 therapeutic reasons why our patients are using cannabis, risks and contraindications, and then we'll just briefly go through some of the takeaways. To kick things off, I just wanted to start with Did you know? Did you know that the Australian Journal of General Practice was quoted as saying cannabis is a relatively safe drug and is not associated with fatal overdoses? On the basis of animal lethal dosing studies, the human lethal dose of THC has been extrapolated to be over 15,000 milligrams. This highlights that THC has a very wide safety margin, as this lethal dose is 750 times greater than a typical intoxicating dose of 20 milligrams. Unlike the opioids, cannabis does not cause respiratory depression because of a paucity of cannabinoid receptor expression in the brainstem. Something closer to home, a 2021 Statista survey showed that roughly 17% of the Wisconsin adult population, which is just over 1 million people, had tried cannabis at least once in the past year. And then a 2022 Marquette Law poll indicated that 80% of the Wisconsin voters support a medical marijuana program. I put these 2 bullet points in here just to show that an increasing number of our patient population may just be using a form of cannabinoid product. Now let's get into a little bit about cannabis and the history. Around 8,000-9,000 BC, the earliest known hemp products were found, and these came in the forms of ropes and textiles. Around 2700 BC, the oldest known written record on cannabis use came from the Chinese Emperor Shennong's Pharmacopoeia. Emperor Shennong was a well-known farmer and is also considered to be the father of Chinese medicine. In his Pharmacopoeia, he used cannabis tea to treat gout, rheumatism, malaria, and poor memory. Around 129 to 200 AD, a Greek physician named Claudius Galen used cannabis therapeutically, but did warn of use in large amounts. Quoted, "It was customary in Italy to serve small cakes containing marijuana for dessert. The seeds create a feeling of warmth and, if consumed in large amounts, affect the head by sending to it a warm and toxic vapor. It is the first written record that overconsumption may produce unwanted effects." Dr. Galen also was the first recorded physician that described cannabis as an analgesic. In 1841, we have Dr. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, who was the first Western-trained physician, author, and scientist that studied cannabis with the help of research from India. He also revitalized medical cannabis throughout the West. He researched cannabis with many animal models and children with the use of different preparations based on native recipes. One of his well-known patients was a 40-day-old child with convulsions that was on its deathbed. With the cannabis preparations, he was able to help relieve that child of convulsions and lead a normal and quality improved life. Although this next slide looks a little busy, it is filled with a lot of important information. This is the part in time in our history that we start to see cannabis take on a form of something dangerous and monstrous. So in 1914, we have the Harrison Narcotics Act. This is where narcotics must be registered with the Bureau of Internal Revenue under the U.S. Treasury Department. Although cannabis was not on this list, unlike opium and heroin, we have a gentleman named Harry J. Anslinger who begins his campaign against cannabis. Now, mind you, this was before the DEA was established. Mr. Anslinger was quoted as saying, early on, he was on record essentially saying cannabis was no big deal. He called the idea that it made people mad or violent an absurd fallacy. Now, I put this in this slide because you're going to see how his demeanor changes as time goes on. In 1930, we have Mr. Anslinger, who served under the Hoover Kennedy administration, become the first director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, again, before the DEA. On this, his platform was based on race and violence. stated that cannabis promotes addiction, mental disorder, and violence. Anslinger is quoted as saying there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, and Filipinos and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing results from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and others. He preferred the term marijuana instead of cannabis, designed to be anti-Mexican. 1936, we have a movie called Reefer Madness, which turns out to be an anti-cannabis film that Mr. Anslinger helped influence. In this film, teenagers become addicted to these things called reefers that are sold by shameless and corrupt drug dealers. 1937 starts the Marijuana Tax Act, which is also under Mr. Anslinger's doing. It is established that any importation, cultivation, possession, or distribution of marijuana were regulated and paid an annual tax of $24 a year. Back in that to now, today's monetary value is about $509. 1970, we start to see the development of the Controlled Substance Act, which replaces the Marijuana Tax Act. Where this comes into play is it places all substances that originally has been overseen by the federal government into one of five categories based on the use, potential for abuse, safety, and dependency liability. This is where cannabis was placed in the Schedule 1 that we still fight today, which means that there is no meaningful accepted medical application, there is a high potential for abuse, and a lack of accepted safety under medical supervision. 1971, we had the Nixon War on Drugs. Nixon is quoted as saying that cannabis is public enemy number one. His senior advisor, John Ehrlichman, was later quoted as saying, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." As I said before, I know this slide seems busy, but you can see how the development of race and fear helped to promote the idea that cannabis in and of itself is a horrible and harmful drug. This next slide, you start to see a turn of events. You start to see how the climate is starting to change and how cannabis use is starting to become more accepted. In 1996, California legalized medical marijuana under the Compassionate Use Act, meaning that certain patients and their primary caregivers would be exempt from criminal liability under state law for the possession and cultivation of marijuana for medical use. What I find is interesting about the state of California is they were the first state to criminalize cannabis use in 1907, and it took about 90 years for them to come to an understanding that cannabis could be therapeutically useful for certain patients. 2012, Colorado became the first state to legalize recreational use. 2012 was also the same year that CBD was shown to alleviate schizophrenia symptoms in patients, comparable to conventional medications. 2018, Canada is the second country to legalize cannabis, also marking cannabis the most commonly used illegal drug. The first country to legalize cannabis was Uruguay in 2013. On these next couple of slides, I would like to talk more about updated terminology. For those of you out there that are familiar with the cannabis world, I'm sure that you have heard the words strain, indica, and sativa. Today's world of cannabis, those strains are a bit outdated, but let's talk about where they began. In 1753, Linnaeus, who was a Swedish botanist, identified a single species of hemp. This hemp that he called Cannabis sativa L, L for Linnaeus, he named it after himself. In 1785, biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed that there were two species, indica strain from India and the neighboring countries, and the sativa strain, which came from the western continent. Lamarck stated that there was coevolution, but this classification was rejected about 50 years later, where it then returned to a single species of Cannabis sativa L. Up until 1976, when Small and Cronquist divided a single species into two subspecies of Cannabis sativa L, and they did this based on the intoxicating ability of the plant, similar to what we do today when we chemotype, which we will get into more at later slides. In general, the word strain has no official status in botany. When we talk about strain, we're more talking about virus and bacterium. And also due to the hybridization and overproduction, these two species are unessential. The words indica and sativa used to mean where you got your product from, which type of plant. The the indica plant would be more bushier and was known for more relaxing and sedative effects, while the sativa plant was taller and thinner and was used more for energizing. But again, due to hybridization and overproduction, these terms are more used to express the high that one feels after using a product that was harvested from a plant. So when we discuss what is the proper verbiage to use when discussing different cannabis types, the words chemovar and cultivar are the best routes to take when you're discussing about different plant species. Chemovar just means a chemical variation of the plant. Cultivar is also similar and is also well respected in the world of cannabis. These two words are more correct when referring to chemical variation of particular cannabis plants. They classify the plant by the chemical compounds or common characteristics, making it more precise for botany. For instance, on the previous slide, we were talking about chemotyping, chemotype 1, chemotype 2, and chemotype 3. Chemotype 1 is a plant that has a lot of THC in it. Chemotype 2 is something that is 50-50, and chemotype 3 is something that has a lot of CBD compared to THC. Again, you don't really understand that just by looking at the plant. This is more about how it's chemically profiled. As Dr. Ethan Russo, and cannabis specialist, coined, morphology doesn't predict biochemistry anymore due to the overproduction and hybridization of the plant. All right, now time for some fun. Let's talk about cannabis pharmacotherapy. Let's start off this slide with the definition of pharmacotherapeutics, just as a gentle refresher. Pharmacotherapeutics incorporates pharmacokinetics, which the body does to the medication, and pharmacodynamics, how the medication acts on the body to achieve the effect we're looking for. The endocannabinoid system. From what I understand, about 9% of medical schools actually teach about this. And so let's kind of breeze through this, not very quickly, but quick enough. The ECS is the master regulator. It is responsible for controlling many of our critical bodily functions. For instance, it's there to support us in eating, anxiety, learning and memory, reproduction, metabolism, growth, and development. Basically, the ECS just wants our body to stay in homeostasis and be happy. Through the ECS, we have two main receptors, the CB1 receptor and the CB2, also known as the cannabinoid receptor 1 and cannabinoid receptor 2. Now, mind you, we do have minor receptors, but we're not going to get into those today. We also have ligands, which are our endogenous cannabinoids, the cannabinoids that our body makes in and of itself. And with that, we have anandamide, aka AEA, and 2-arachidonoglycerol, also known as 2-AG. For enzymes to help make and break these ligands, we're going to talk about the Fa enzyme that helps to produce AEA and the Magle enzyme that helps to produce 2-AG. Just as a reminder, or just as a bit of information, these enzymes work a little bit opposite than regular enzymes, for these do not degrade at the synaptic cleft. For example, 2-AG is metabolized in the presynaptic neuron with the help of MAGL, while AEA is metabolized in the postsynaptic neuron after the function is complete with the help of the Fa enzyme. On this very vivid picture that I found on Phytech's website, we can see the cannabinoid signaling cascade. In this slide, we're going to discuss the glutamate neurotransmitter. Now, although there are other neurotransmitters that are affected by THC, this slide represents the glutamate neurotransmitter. Up top, we see the presynaptic neuron. The calcium channel gates are opening, thus releasing the calcium ion flow. Through that, the neurotransmitter vesicle then releases the glutamate neurotransmitter in the presynaptic cleft. Once reaching the postsynaptic neuron, we can see how the function of glutamate has an effect on the postsynaptic neuron. In here, we see the production of 2-AG and AEA. 2-AG is represented by the more turquoise color. AEA is more the pinkish color. Once glutamate neurotransmitter reaches the postsynaptic cleft and these two ligands are produced, we can see how they flow to the presynaptic neuron, thus interacting with the CB1 receptor. Once this is accomplished, we can see how the CB1 receptor then sends a signal to the calcium channel gate telling it to close, and thus reducing the amount of glutamate that is being produced. Once this effect is all taken place, we can see how 2-AG stays in the presynaptic neuron and is catabolized and broken down to glycerol and arachidonic acid. We can also see how anandamide falls back down into the postsynaptic neuron and is catabolized by the Pha enzyme into arachidonic acid and ethanolamine. Over to the right, we see a green molecule. That green molecule represents THC. We can see how THC bypasses the production and degradation that 2AG and AEA has to go through. But we also see how the THC molecule also interacts with the CB1 receptor. That interaction also will close that calcium channel gate, thus decreasing the amount of glutamate that is produced. On this slide, we can see better the location of where the CB1 and CB2 receptors are located. On the left in the blue, we can see that the CB1 receptor is located more in the central nervous system, while the CB2, represented by the color orange, is more in the periphery. In the center column, we can see pictures of the receptors and ligands. We can also see how the ligands and receptors work similar to a lock and key method. THC as well has a similar structure as AEA and 2AG. That's because THC is a partial CB1, CB2 agonist, meaning that it will mimic the effects of 2AG and AEA. CBD, on the other hand, is a negative allosteric modulator, which means that it will change how the receptors will interact with different ligands. On the right, we see kind of more of a downplayed image that we saw on the previous slide. This is also the same as the presynaptic, postsynaptic exchange between different receptors and ligands. All right, now let's talk a little bit more about the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol, THC and CBD, the two main ingredients that most people are familiar with from the cannabis plant. These are called phytocannabinoids because they are from plant material. Delta-9 is the main psychoactive ingredient in the plant. It is a partial CB1 and CB2 agonist as stated prior, meaning it will form a weak bond and produce a lessened response than the intended chemical AEA and 2AG. Cannabidiol, CBD, is a non-competitive negative allosteric modulator of the CB1 receptor, meaning that it will change the receptor's response to a different stimulus. It may also be competitive and block THC, thus lessening the response. CBD can also activate the CB1 receptor by increasing the amount of anandamide by inhibiting the Pha enzyme that breaks anandamide down. On the right, we see different areas of the brain that are affected. In purple, we can see the effects of THC, and in green, we can see the effects of CBD. Up top in the black, we see the areas of the brain, and in the red, we see the different areas that can be affected. I wanted to put a quick slide in here about THC physiology and metabolism before we get into drug-drug interactions, because THC seems to be something that people are concerned about due to drug testing and how long it stays in your body and how it's metabolized. So at the top, you can see the arrows. Delta-9 THC is the psychoactive component of the cannabis plant. Once ingested, delta-9 THC can turn into either 11-hydroxy-THC or 11-carboxy-THC. THC, like CBD and hundreds of other pharmaceutical medications, are broken down by the CYP450 enzymes in the liver. THC happens to interact with 2C9 and 3A4. Again, this will be broken down into 11-hydroxy-THC, which is psychoactive, and 11-carboxy-THC, which is non-psychoactive. When we discuss metabolism and excretion, roughly 65% is excreted in the feces, 20% is excreted in the urine, and the majority of it will be excreted in 5 days. THC has a half-life of roughly 1.3 days. Now, mind you, again, we have to understand how much a person is using and what kind of product they are using. Inhaled bioavailability is about 10 to 35%, and ingested is 100% due to the fact that it's going through the stomach, getting into the bloodstream, and going directly to the liver. THC is highly fat soluble, meaning whatever is not excreted most likely will turn up in the adipose tissue and stored in the fat cells. This is part of the PowerPoint where there's a lot of frustration and confusion when it comes to cannabis as a therapy, especially when there's concern of cannabis interacting with other prescribed medications. So prior to starting out this slide, I want to just go over a couple of quick definitions. The first one is substrates. Substrates are substances that are metabolized by an enzyme. Inducers are things that increase enzymatic activity, thus decreasing the amount of concentration and activity from a substrate. Inhibitors do just the opposite. They reduce enzymatic activity, thus increasing the substrate concentration. As we said on the previous slide, the CYP450 enzymes metabolize most chemicals and hundreds of pharmaceutical drugs. There are more than 50 isoenzymes in this family. Depending on the route, THC interacts with CYP-A12 or 1A2 as an inducer. Other medications in this realm include caffeine, clozapine, olanzapine, duloxetine, estradiol, lidocaine, naproxen, and propranolol. It can also inhibit the 3A4, 2C9, and 2D6, thus increasing drug effects, leading to adverse reactions. Now, mind you, other inhibitors are examples of grapefruit, macrolides, azole antifungals, etc. What I find is interesting is people that have a fully functioning liver and are using cannabis in therapeutic dosages, other medications don't react very strongly to cannabis also being in the system. Through a systematic review, the only medication I could find that actually had an increase in serum levels was clobazam. CBD interactions are also metabolized through the CYP450 enzymes by the 3A4, 2C9, and 2C19. It is a potent competitive 3A4 inhibitor, which for any medication that you're worried about grapefruit, this one is going to be worse. And 2D6, which metabolizes roughly 25% of the pharmaceutical drugs that we provide. CBD is also known to slow the metabolism of many medications, such as beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, SSRIs, TCAs, etc. But also being a 3A4 inhibitor, it can also decrease the metabolism of THC, thus having it float around in your body a lot longer. This is a fun slide that I found showing different receptors and potential uses as to why some of our patients use cannabis. You can see in blue we have our CBD, pink CBC, CBG, and THCA. And we can also see the different receptors that they work on, such as the PPAR gamma, TRPV1s, CB1 and CB2, a bunch of different receptors and potential uses that we didn't talk about in this lecture, but I just wanted to put that out there for future lectures that I will be authoring coming up. This is one of my favorite slides that I wrote. I feel like there's a lot of misconception between recreational and medicinal use. So I wanted to break them down for everybody that's listening. Recreational programs are also known as adult use programs. These are for people either 18 to 21 years of age or older, and there are 24 states, 2 territories, and the District of Columbia that have them. The people that are in these types of programs or purchase these type of products enjoy the mind-altering effects rather than using it for health benefits. They consume for the high feeling that THC produces, which means they will usually experiment with the most potent chemotype, chemotype 1 with a lot of THC in it, and they use a lot of it. They prefer the most potent products such as high concentrates, oils, or waxes. Medicinal, on the other hand, are individuals that are using cannabis to treat medicinal conditions, for example, chronic pain, MS spasticity, nausea from chemotherapy. They're using this as a medication. I like to also call it as a therapy. The Food and Drug Administration approved derivatives such as Epidiolex, which is a roughly 97-98% CBD, for epilepsy in children. Dronabinol and Nabilone are both THC derivatives that are also FDA approved. The people in this program do need a physician's recommendation to purchase or get a card from a physician, and they will need to be assessed and diagnosed for a medical cannabis card. Both of these programs, if bought in a dispensary, are taxed, but there really is no difference between the products. Both should be tested for pesticides, heavy metals, and potency. When discussing with patients as a nurse, and also as doing research with systematic reviews meta-analysis, and random controlled studies. The top 5 reasons why our patients are using cannabis is for chronic pain. Fibromyalgia is the number one um, physical ailment. Anxiety is the number one mental health diagnosis that people are using cannabis for. PTSD, cannabis is shown to improve quality of sleep and decrease the nightmares. Depression, it is shown that AEA has antidepressant effects. AEA is one of our endocannabinoid ligands. It helps activation of CB1 receptors in the ventromedial and the prefrontal cortex, thus helping with antidepressant effects. And as stated with the PTSD, insomnia, it helps with the quality of sleep. This slide helps to break down some of our patients' history, chronic diseases that could be a concern for cannabis use. The first one is history of psychosis. I know that this has been in the news quite a bit lately. So people with a history of psychosis, recent delirium, or family history, meaning someone with a first-degree relative with a history of psychosis has a 10% baseline risk, which is doubled if they become regular users of cannabis. Be mindful though, acute cannabis-induced psychosis has been documented, but it is rare. Some argue against the view that cannabis causes schizophrenia by citing that the rapid increase in global cannabis use in recent decades has not translated into an increased incidence of schizophrenia. But just be mindful. Family or personal history of substance use disorder should be monitored. Cannabis is a substance, um, and with a history of substance use, that is just something to discuss with your patients that want to try CBD or try THC products. Individuals younger than 18 years of age have a higher risk of dependence. The concern of cannabis dependence in those using is purely for medicinal purposes has yet to be adequately studied. When I read a lot of the research is coming from recreational users, not so much from medicinal use. Pregnancy. Cannabis tends to stay in breast milk for up to 6 days. Although it is ethically unsound to do studies on pregnant women in cannabis, we do have some research from 1982 to 1997 in Jamaica. This research showed that there was low cause of harm in the children that were born, and those that had mothers that used cannabis during pregnancy had an advanced neurodevelopment compared to those mothers that did not use cannabis in those times. Mind you, Jamaica has a culture of cannabis use, but very little alcohol use. Cannabis-induced hyperemesis syndrome um, is referring to long-term heavy recreational use. There's no evidence of medicinal use. Dr. Ethan Russo, who I had stated earlier on in the PowerPoint, did some research. I'm not sure where he was in the United States, um, but in the conclusion, after the data was compiled, he was stated as saying, can contemporaneously be conceived of not as a functional GI disorder, but rather as a manifestation of gene-environment interaction in a rare genetic disease unmasked by a toxic reaction to excessive THC exposure. Again, this is more for recreational use. If you would like to read that study, it will be at the end of my PowerPoint. I know AHA had put out a study saying that those with heart problems and using cannabis have a higher incident of having a cardiac incident or having a heart attack or stroke. So individuals with a history of angina or myocardial infarction should be monitored. Acute uses do increase the heart rate by roughly 8 beats per minute within the first hour of inhalation. That is also dose dependent. But what was also shown is repeated dosing tolerance kicks in and effects diminish. Longer term use has shown to actually decrease blood pressure. Those with liver or kidney disease should also be monitored as well. We do know that cannabis does metabolize through the cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver. Again, these are things that you should talk about with your patients if they do open up and discuss cannabis use with you. So how do we talk about cannabis use with our patients? A lot of patients don't want to talk with their providers, especially in a state that has cannabis as being an illegal medication or an illegal substance. They just fear of getting in trouble and they also don't want to be judged. So given the current state, Cannabis is illegal in Wisconsin, but the access to cannabis in all forms, as well as CBD, is relatively easy to procure. Providers need to know how to discuss and educate their patients on their medical history, such as the red flags from the last slide. Choice of product. What are they using? Are they using something high in THC or high in CBD? And what is their preferred method? Do they prefer edibles or do they prefer inhalation? How often and how much are they using? And just try to educate them on and not driving. That would be beneficial for everybody. So again, discuss the cannabinoid use with your patient. Just make it a routine, small talk. How are they using their product? What are they using? Are they using CBD, THC? Would they like some more information on it? It's been shown that a lot of patients are relying on friends, family, news outlets, and online websites for their information. Developing a trusting relationship with your patient is very important. They want to look at you as a reliable resource for cannabis use. So, what better way to go about that than just having an open and casual conversation about what they're using and how they're using their product? So, some basic key takeaways from this presentation. Medicinal cannabis users is very different than recreational users. Medical cannabis users are using it because they're suffering from something and they just want to feel normal again. Recreational users want to use the strongest product, the newest way to do it, because they just want that high sensation. Remember, proper terminology is important. Strain is outdated, marijuana is outdated, cannabis, cultivar, and chemovar um, are the adequate responses when using different terms. Hemp and cannabis may be the same species, but they're very different chemical profile wise, such as chemotype 1, 2, and 3. I know that there's a lot of CBD dispensaries promoting legal THC as hemp derived. That will be included in my next presentation. Remember, cannabis is a compound. There are many components to it. It has over 120 cannabinoids and over 400 phytochemicals, compounds that are produced by plants. It is an interesting plant, it is an interesting therapy, and it could use some more research. CBD and THC are metabolized through common pathways as other medications, cytochrome P450. As long as you have a functional liver and you're using therapeutic amounts of cannabis and THC, there should not be all that much worry about drug-drug interactions, unless, of course, it's clobazam for epilepsy. More patients are using cannabis as a therapy. Just talk with them. Educate yourself, educate your patients, and hopefully we can then educate our society. I want to say thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I would love any and all questions. Again, this will be accompanied with a 7-question survey based on implementation science to help me make this PowerPoint lecture a little bit better, and more informative. Whatever questions you have, good, bad, or other, I would love to read them. My information is down below there. You can reach me at jchristians2@wis.edu, and I'm always available by phone. Thank you again for your time. I hope this was educational. I hope it was fun to listen to as it was for me to produce. Here's page 1 of my references, and on the next slide, you'll see page 2. Again, some of the research that I used was from Dr. Ethan Russo, and he will be on the next slide. Here's page 2 of the references. And again, Dr. Ethan Russo about the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. If you want to read about the research, it's all right there, kind of in the middle of the page. Again, I want to say thank you. I hope you have a lovely day, and I can't wait to read your feedback.